Okay, good morning, everybody. This is a somewhat unusually timed meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Thanks, everyone, for joining. The idea for this meeting was uh, there's a lot going on, and it would be very helpful before we meet on December 16th for you all as a council to do two things at least. One is get a sense of a lot of the public input that's been happening, engagement efforts, public input sessions, and just get a window into that. And then also we've invited subcommittee co-chairs to join us today to talk a little bit about how it's going with them, any kind of sticky issues that they might want to flag to you now, and overall sort of things they want to make sure that you as a council are aware of, and perhaps they even might have a question or two for you. We just have a 2-hour meeting today to do this. I am happy to show the agenda, and maybe someone could throw it into the chat as well. Here we go. Great. So thanks, Liz. Okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen with what we're aiming to do today. This is what we have on deck. Kelly's here, I think. Yeah. We wanted as a sort of a just transition moment, as we'd like to do in most meetings, talk about the approach for public comment and how it's been going in the subcommittees and whether this approach that subcommittees were adopting over the summer would be appropriate for the full council. So that's what we'll do first. Then we've got 2 blocks of time. One, public engagement. You've got a big monster packet on Friday, and we'll talk a little bit of what's in there. I've got a short presentation, then we'll do a little exercise around reflecting on what we're hearing, and then subcommittee co-chairs talking about challenging issues. That's what we got. Public comment at the end here, just before noon, and then we adjourn. Any questions on the agenda? Okay, great. We do have minutes. They're not linked right here, but they are on the website. So I just encourage everyone to take a moment, if you haven't, take a peek at those minutes and we can approve them from our last meeting. I'll give you a moment to do that. Okay. Anyone need a little more time for minutes or have a concern or how the minutes are from the last meeting? Okay. I'm not hearing
David,
requests. Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
sorry, I see at the 12:10 section
Yeah.
that the updated social cost of greenhouse gases was presented, but it doesn't record our consensus unanimous adoption of those recommendations as a formal action, which occurred.
Oh, look at that. Thank you. Yes. Great catch. Let's fix that.
Oh, actually, no, it is later. Apparently, sorry, it's at 12:30. It's
Oh, yeah, there it is.
after the public comment. My apologies.
Yeah. Like, how did we do that? Yes, there it is. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other reflections or comments on the minutes? Okay. Not hearing any concerns or requests for more time. Let's consider those approved. Thanks so much. All right. So the first thing we wanted to do was talk about public comment. And that was a nice little example there of how public comment was used in our last meeting. This is something, Kelly, I'm happy to turn this over to you or riff a little bit on this. There was a document that was prepared called Best Practices for Vermont Climate Council Subcommittees on Public Comment. And I'll just put this in the chat. It's posted online. It should be this. And subcommittees have been doing it. We've been kind of doing it as a council as well, as shown by that little exchange right now with Jared, where we put some public comment um, in between our discussion and then the council decision making. Kelly, do you want to just say a word about the intent here and if you or other subcommittee folks have some thoughts about how this has been going, and whether this is appropriate for the full council to sort of more formally adopt?
Yeah, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
My microphone's been iffy on this computer. So thanks. I mean, I'd love to hear from any subcommittees that have been doing this and if they have feedback. I think that would be really helpful. But the purpose of this was to have it so that we would really be hearing and considering public comment before making important decisions, that we would be receiving public comment that's relevant to our subcommittees in a timely fashion, um, and helping to make sure it's a two-way street so that people who are commenting are feeling heard and that um, their comments are being taken seriously. So I don't know if we wanted to look at it again real quick. A lot of us have reviewed it when we first approved it for subcommittee use, but we may want to take a quick refresher, or if there's immediate feedback the from anyone on the subcommittees about their experience using it there. Happy to do that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And I just realized that the link I sent in the chat was the version that was presented to the council, and the council actually had some edits to it, and am feeling regretful that I don't have that version handy. But the edits to the version that you all this was in your July meeting, that I will either throw them in the chat or I'll just show that you all as a council reviewed this back in July and you had some thoughts, right? Where you wanted to make sure that it would read that public comment should be after presentation of substantive information and initial discussion, but before final deliberation and decision making. Very much like what we did on the social cost of greenhouse gases in your meeting in September, right? That's the pathway we did for that. And then we also wanted to, during the meeting section, add a mention of the expectation of respectful interaction and no personal attacks. So those are changes that we made. I just apologize that I don't have the updated version handy. I grabbed the wrong one before this meeting. Oh, good. Sophie dropped it in the chat. Okay, even better. Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Okay, so subcommittee members or people who've been sitting on subcommittees might have been witnessing this. How has this gone? Has it been working well? Have there been any hiccups? Any implications that might be relevant for us as a full council? Feel free to chime in, folks, if you've been sitting on subcommittees or running them. Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, I can weigh in. I don't know how helpful it'll be with regard to the process, which we did adopt coming after the July meeting. But I would say across sector, we're getting very little public attendance and little to no public comment during the monthly subcommittee meetings. I did look back at our minutes just to kind of test that and reflect. And we're leaving time on the agenda at least once or twice. But we're not getting a lot of input from members of the public. I think at the last council meeting, one member of the public commented that, cross sector spent half of its meeting talking about process, which was probably a pretty fair evaluation of one of the meetings. But I do think we've also been very presentation focused, and there has not been a lot of meaty discussion happening in the cross sector monthly meetings. I think that may be a function of a lot of that happening at the task group level, and those meetings are not necessarily public. But I would say, and then of course, in addition, we're doing the input sessions outside of our monthly meetings where I would say we are getting a lot of good feedback from the public. But at the monthly meetings, just so the council's aware, doesn't seem to be soliciting a good amount of input from members of the public.
Yeah, and I see Andrea in the chat saying the same thing. And there could be multiple reasons for that. Okay. So do counselors have any concerns though in adopting this as a pathway for you as a council? Again, it's more like instruction for me and others about how to structure an agenda, right? This is what this is kind of about. Just curious if counselors have any thoughts about this. Um, any hesitations or any things that might need to be adapted because the council might be a little different than subcommittees? Any thoughts on this? Okay.
David, I'll just chime in if I can, to say also that the meetings that we've been having in rural resilience we haven't really been deliberating on anything. It's been a lot of information sharing. So the way that document was set up was sort of like make sure that we get the input before we make decisions. I think that's going to change in the next few weeks. We'll be making a lot more decisions, you know, and even beyond when we start to get into the meat of the document. But yeah, I'll just, you know, put that out there. It hasn't been completely applicable yet. And rural resilience, if I honestly cannot even remember anyone from the public attending, maybe one person, one subcommittee meeting with just very low attendance, same as Melissa said.
Okay. That's really helpful to know. Okay. All right. Anything else to say on this? And then I'll do a moment of just like formally if you all want to adopt this or not. But anything else to say before we do that?
I would add one more thing. Obviously, if you look at it, there's a lot of language about subcommittee this, subcommittee that. So we would need to update it, edit it to say council meetings and things like that. But don't know that that's a big lift or would be controversial.
Yeah.
But that would need to be done before it was officially adopted, probably.
So I would say you all could today adopt it, knowing that the document would be updated to say council and subcommittees, right? That would be a quick fix, I think, if folks are comfortable doing that. Okay. Anything else to say? Any reflections on this? Okay. Do folks have any concerns about adopting this to apply to the council? Well, we can update the document so it says council and subcommittees. Any concerns about adopting this as a council?
David, I'm not sure why we're adopting something that doesn't actually reflect what we're adopting. Maybe I missed something, but is it not possible for us to get the updated document and then vote on that? That would be a more orderly process.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. That would be a little bit more orderly. I guess we can absolutely do that in the next meeting. I'd be interested in a signal from you all if the only change to the document would be literally saying council and subcommittees. There'd be nothing substantive. And so in the meantime, it may be helpful to get a signal from you all so that we can start structuring agendas to do that. So maybe we can save the formality for when we have the actual document. Let me just check with the signal though. I am taking a signal away from here that I'm not hearing concerns about doing this beyond what you just said, June. Okay, great. Thank you for your input. When we have an actual document, we can more formalize that adoption. Okay, super. All right, speaking of input, the first piece on our agenda is all about public input. And while in the subcommittees, what you're hearing from co-chairs is there has not been a lot of public attendance at subcommittee meetings, there has been a ton of activity in the last month or two or so on proactively going out and trying to solicit input from a variety of Vermonters. And you all got that beefy packet at Friday late. It summarized a bunch of activity, which I'm going to throw a PowerPoint up or a slide presentation up and walk you through that. We can't go through so much content. If you notice, that document was something like 50 something pages long or more, I can't remember. And maybe actually I could ask Sophie or Liz Amler or someone to drop the link to that document in the chat, the long one. But what I wanted to do was something similar to what we did in September. Remember in September, I did a quick presentation and then there was like 5 minutes of reading time. And then we had a discussion about what we heard, what we're hearing or what we're reading. I'd like to do the same thing in the time we have. We have until 11. So I'll take 10 minutes or so to walk through a presentation that sort of primes the pump about what's in there. Then I'll have everybody just take 5 minutes, read one thing. If you've already done some reading in the document, great, read something else. If you haven't, pick one thing you want to read through, one or two, and then let's have a conversation about what folks are seeing. All right, so that's the plan. Let me pull this presentation up. And I will say that this work has been the result of a lot of effort from the Climate Action Office, particularly Sophie Veltrop, and also the co-chairs of the subcommittees who have worked, and the task leads of the subcommittees who worked really hard to prepare content to share and then to be present at these input sessions. And then there's also been work on the CBI team to reach a wide range of Vermonters, and we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, hang on a second. Let's get this going. Okay, these slides are also posted, and I will just caveat that it's kind of impossible to summarize content in a short way. And so if you have some questions as you look at the slide, it really should prompt you to go look at the longer write-up, because the full content and things like that won't be possible to do in a 10-minute slideshow, which is what I'm about to do. All right, so here we go. There were 6 input sessions, and then we'll talk about 4 other things that happened that are part of that big briefing packet that you have in your email. All right, the 6 input sessions, which were really driven by the subcommittees, and each of the 3 subcommittees that are doing substantive work on recommendations did 2. And they did 2 because the Climate Action Office and our team limited them to 2 because we didn't have capacity to do more, at least to support them in doing more. So cross sector did a 1 on transportation and 1 on buildings and thermal. Ag and Ecosystem did 1 on agriculture and another on natural lands and forestry. And then the Rural Resilience and Adaptation did 1 specifically sort of targeting businesses, which was a voice that they felt they needed to hear a little bit more from, and then 1 around town support and municipalities. All right, so those are the ones that happened. Let me give you just a flavor of the kinds of things that happened in there, maybe to tempt you to go read some of these summaries in more detail. All right, transportation. For those of you who sat in on the transportation one, you heard a lot of talk about public and active transportation. There's a lot of enthusiasm in that space. It's tricky because from a climate benefit standpoint, it's one piece of the puzzle, but just one piece. But there's a lot of enthusiasm out there around transit and public transportation, also about making the transition to electrification more accessible. A lot of talk about how low-income communities can participate in the transformation of the transportation sector. Yeah, and what else? A lot of talk about how this all might get funded, and interest in how we can fund public transportation and also fund the affordability of the electrification of the sector. In terms of electrification, also an emphasis on how do you crack the nut on multifamily units and charging and renters and things like that. And those are difficult challenges. So that was some of the input from transportation, and encourage folks, if they're interested, to dive into that summary a little bit more. Agriculture. Here there is some rich conversation about how Vermont moves forward and leans on traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, ecological knowledge, as it thinks about how to make agriculture sustainable in a changing climate, and the role of agriculture in a changing climate. And there is interest and enthusiasm out there. You heard in the input session around farms and agriculture is part of the climate solution. It's possibility to be part of the sequestering carbon. It's also part of a bigger story around food security, local foods, and rural economies. So there's a lot of input that came in about how do we support farms and farmers in this moment, so that they're part of the solution, And there's a sense of insecurity right now among a lot of the farming community. You can see in some of these bubbles, some of the topical areas that came up, such as concerns around the way renewable energy is cited, and some of the things I mentioned around taking an ecological approach, and how do we help farmers with land access, and dealing with development pressures and things like that. So that's some of the things you'll read in the summary from the ag input session. In the rural resilience in business, one of the things that I listened to, I helped facilitate that one, and one of the things that jumped out at me on that was how much there's a sense that businesses and municipalities and other entities need to be interacting much more proactively before some major event happens, like a flood or some climate issue happens. And so that sort of proactive relationship building can be a pathway towards greater resilience, and a pathway towards more rapid recovery in the event of climate disasters such as floods. There's interest in grants and other types of programs that can specifically target businesses and small businesses, which may fall through the cracks of some of the other types of aid and help, particularly in the wake of floods and other issues. And overall, a sense as well that business community is interested in participating in local conversations about the vitality of local communities and the resilience of local communities in the face of a changing climate. So those are the kinds of things that were said, and encourage you to dive into that summary if some of those things pique your interest. And I'm sure as folks who participate in these calls are hearing me say this, there's some other things jumping to mind. So thanks for that. And feel free to maybe drop some things in the chat as I go if you're like, oh, wait, don't forget to mention this. All right. Here we go. Buildings and thermal. Here, you can see the types of things that were top of mind and a lot of the input that came in. Again, some attention to how does this all play out for Vermonters of different income levels, and how does this transition work particularly for low-income Vermonters, and the fact that a lot of the assistance today is about fuel assistance, and how does that all shake out when you're trying to electrify, and the importance of aligning federal programs with state goals and things like that. There was discussion about contractors, building codes, workforce issues. There was discussion about how what needs to happen in the building stock becomes part of the education for contractors and generally in education. And yeah, talk about technical feasibility. There's more in that summary. I welcome folks to dive into it. There's some nice input for these issues of buildings and thermal. On natural lands and forestry, this was the second one of the ag and ecosystem one. There was a lot of discussion. In the same way there was discussion about supporting farmers, there's a lot of discussion about supporting the forest folks who are in the forest economy, and folks also to manage their forests successfully. And for some folks on this call, and here that we had a range of views on this call, there was a real emphasis on how does public policy encourage the many private landholders across the state to make wise decisions on their forestry, including decisions around letting forests stand. So some policy questions around that. There were differences, sort of strong differences expressed around the role of biomass as a product and whether that should be used in energy or not. And
saying the reminder about the dance was the first she was
hey, Jane, did somebody mute Jane? Um,
Okay.
it's
There-
not mine. Hang on one second. Liz, could you do me a favor and mute Jane's mic because it's not my.
Oh, there's a huge crew.
Hang, Jane, there we go. Thanks. And then the last one here is the rural resilience and town support. And here, again, comments around building local communication and collaboration, thinking about the existing planning mechanisms and resources, a lot about collaboration in this one, and connectedness. Again, I encourage you, if this is piquing your interest, to look at the summary for some more detail on this one. All right, so there's a few other things I wanted to say before we pause. There's 4 other things in that briefing packet. 3 of these are events that happened in the last period of time, in the last month or so, that were really targeting specific groups of Vermonters. And then the 4th thing here is just our quarterly summary, which you've looked at you've looked at previous quarters. This is the most recent one, which is July to September. And so we included that in. It's just recently was done a week or so ago. And so here, if you pop into these summaries in the packet, you're going to see things like this. So this came about because the Climate Action Office, and through the work that we're helping with and CBI is helping with, we're developing some relationship with community action agencies across the state. And those community action agencies explicitly asked for a conversation about the proposed clean heat standard. And so we facilitated a conversation between the PUC and CAP agency and some of their clients about, sort of the implications of this proposed clean heat standard. There's a lot of questions folks had. And these were the kinds of things that came out of that conversation. Concerns about what I mentioned earlier, like fuel assistance doesn't cover electricity for heat pumps. It's really tricky if you don't have upfront cash. How do you do these transitions? Mobile homes in particular can be tough fits for some things, like heat pump hot water heaters are tough there. And so there's some specific things that came out of these conversations that I think are interesting to read through, and I encourage you to take a peek at that summary and what's in there. And what you can see on the screen are some of those concerns and topics that came up. As part of this work we're doing with different CAP agencies with Capstone, they convened a group of their clients along with some of their staff. And we did a sort of focus group type conversation with them about a range of things that are emerging out of the revision of the Climate Action Plan. And what's on this slide is just a very opening exercise the team did about, when you hear the words climate change, what comes to mind? There's a whole bunch of notes in the packet about the subsequent conversation, but we threw this up on the slide to pique your interest. Again, trying to lift up voices, in particular of low-income Vermonters or Vermonters with moderate low incomes. There was a really interesting event that happened in mid-October that some of you here participated in, where it followed on a bunch of focus groups that happened over the last winter, spring timeframe with Vermonters, we say linguistically diverse Vermonters, folks where English may not be their first language. And unlike the previous time when we did focus groups specifically in specific languages, this time we invited a bunch of community leaders from those communities to together come. And not only did we talk about what's in the Climate Action Plan, I don't know if you can see, but down in this photo on the bottom right, there's like these little cards, and we made these little note cards that had some of the emerging sort of thematic content coming out of each of the subcommittees. And so we dove into some content of the update to the Climate Action Plan. And in this one, we invited state staff folks who are running programs that are relevant for these issues, whether it's transportation, heating, emergency management. And those staff folks, we had a whole part of this meeting where it's just interacting with them about their programs. And one of the things I encourage you to read in the packet is the reactions from the state staff folks after that experience and that's included in the summary. So look at the bottom of that summary. You can see how the state staff folks who run these programs felt the value of having this conversation. So this was a really interesting event, and we're eager to do things with similar impact in the future. And then finally, the quarterly report, and this is the last thing I'll say. This quarter, you'll see, there were 9 events. This is like peak season in the summer, fall for doing tabling and events. So there's a lot of that. And so we got some input in those sessions. And then we do a detailed write-up on the clean heat standard, which is also in your briefing packet. So that's a double thing. And then there's a write-up about when Kashka Orlo, who's one of the team members, went up and did a day up in the kingdom in Orleans County at a wellness day, and wrote up sort of some of the conversations she had with people at that event. And that's a nice little write-up that's in the quarterly report. Okay, so that's me walking through the variety of things happening. Now, let's stop that. I would love folks to do what we did last time, which is let's just take 5 minutes and then use the remaining 20 minutes to have a conversation about what we're hearing. So if Liz put in the chat the briefing packet, right? The big beefy briefing packet. It should hyperlink the table of contents. Let's just take 5 minutes from now until 10:40. If I could ask all the counselors here on the call and everybody else, frankly, open up that briefing packet and pick something that you can do in 5 minutes, like one summary or 2 summaries, something that you saw me present. And then let's circle back and use the remaining 20 minutes we have to talk about it. All right, so I'm just going to go quiet for 5 minutes. If anybody's having a hard time clicking through to that briefing packet, let me know. But it should be right there from Liz in the chat. All right, so pick whatever you want to do out of that packet for 5 minutes, and I'll circle back and I'll just be quiet for the next 5 minutes. If anybody has any questions, please just let me know. So just take another 30 seconds or so to finish up what you're doing. I know that's a speed read. Okay, so I'll pull you out of the text. And this is a great time if you're a counselor to come back on camera. And let's just have a conversation about some of the things you're hearing. And we know it's like a big range of stuff, right? 6 input sessions on a variety of topics. These other engagement sessions, which also were quite broad on topically, but I'd be interested, counselors, if you just wanted to have some reflections about some messages that you want to make sure you keep present as we move forward into December, January, February, and start to really get into the content of this work. So I'll just open it up, and subcommittee co-chairs, happy to have you jump in on this too. But so counselors and subcommittee co-chairs, what's something that you want to make sure you don't forget as we take the next steps in this process? It can be large or small.
David, I don't see anybody weighing in, so I guess I'll go first.
Great, love it.
Right. I'm gonna step way back. I think these materials are marvelous. I regret that I got them on Friday.
Yeah.
I cannot meaningfully digest all this in such a short period. Sorry, folks. I actually have a daytime job, and it really galls me to think that I'm going to read this on speed for 5 minutes on camera and then have a meaningful discussion about what it says, when at the same time we're trying to do something that is so near and dear to my heart, which is to improve how we reach the people we're trying to serve. And it looks to me like we are really selling that process short in the way that this material is reaching this council and the pro forma, at best, deliberation that is about to occur on stuff that, man, don't I wish we'd heard some of this before we ever designed our plan. So with that said, what I'm seeing in at least 3 chapters is a cost focus, people saying, this is great stuff, but how are we supposed to afford it? And an awful lot of desire for the state to do this, the state to do that, the state to do this, the state to do that. And being a member of administration that has spent the last year and a half at least focused on doing everything we can in flood recovery and confronting in every meeting that we don't have a beat on absolutely everything and enough resources to go everywhere, I'm deeply troubled by the disconnect between what people are aspiring to in these documents and what is actually feasible in this state. So that's my feedback.
Thanks, June. I do appreciate that. Chris?
Yeah, a few things. So again, I quickly scanned these, but I've tried to attend as many of the public input sessions we've had over the last couple of weeks as I could. Couple of high level things. One is, and again, I've kind of come back to the council late, so I'm still in some ways kind of getting my feet under me about like where we're at, where we're going. So apologize for that. But one of the things that's kind of struck me is the emphasis on thermal, which is, I understand, is absolutely important and critical. Not just thermal greenhouse gas reduction as well, but even like last night in the municipal engagement discussion and discussion about rural resilience, is the lack of conversation about adaptation and resilience, especially related to flooding, but not just flooding, it almost feels like we either don't yet know how to have those conversations or are so stuck in the middle of the response that we're still trying to figure out how to have those conversations, or maybe so traumatized it's kind of hard to see our way out. But I'm just a little concerned about a lack of engagement around some, frankly, very existential threats. I don't know that we still have a full grasp on how many units of housing we have lost and will lose over the coming years to the flooding that's already happened. So I'm just kind of concerned about like the absence of that level of discussion among the public that we've engaged with so far. I'm not sure, and I may have missed it. So I'm also putting that out there too. Another thing, quickly, just looking over the business recommendation or the business items, there was discussion about funding that comes through RDCs, regional development corporations, and towns. In our 27 town region, with the possible exception of Brattleboro, I'm not aware of any funding for businesses that goes through towns. So I'm kind of wondering where that comes from. And I know RDCs do help businesses access funding. I can't speak as much to the access questions there. But I was just curious maybe where that's coming from. And that relates to my final comment, which was in a number of different cases, it talks about better sharing of information and collaboration. I would love for us, if possible, to scratch the surface a bit more on the availability of information, because like I'm deep in not only in our region, but also the state as a whole, because for the RPC is on the point of contact on emergency management and recovery. A lot of information gets shared out there about what resources are available. I'm wondering if the information that's out there isn't getting to the right people, but more critically, if what's happening is people are asking for information for programs they can access when the bigger problem is programs may not exist that they can access. So is the issue really, and I'm not questioning it, I'm just saying this, to me, it'd be good to kind of scratch a little deeper on this. Is the actual issue that information's not getting shared, or that they're not seeing information about programs, processes, resources that would actually help meet the needs, whether they're planning needs, implementation, recovery, whatever it is, for them to actually help recover, plan ahead, become more resilient and adaptive. So would love for us to figure out a way to kind of dig a little deeper into what people mean by that.
Thanks. That's helpful. And I think the one about the confusing comment about funding coming through towns, I think I don't want to venture into that terrain, but I bet there is an answer to that. I think in how that came about. Other counselors' reflections in what you've been able to read, either just now or before the meeting, or maybe you participated like Chris in some of these input sessions. You have some reflections on your participation in those sessions. Leslie Ann?
Thanks, David. I have two comments. One is about your presentation and the sort of threads that we're running through. And I was just curious if anybody had a chance as yet to maybe do a deep dive and sort of pull and noodle on some of those threads, because there seem to be circling around themes and concerns that we could sort of elevate and talk a little bit more about. The other piece is I took a look at the culturally and linguistically diverse responses, as well as the focus group that Capstone facilitated. And the thing that struck me was the emphasis on the practicality of a lot of the concerns and suggestions that were raised, and the sense of actual hope in terms of how folks are living and working through what climate change means to them on a day-to-day basis. And I think those are some of the pieces that we probably haven't talked about or appreciated as much as a council right now. And so to the extent that we really lean deeply into lived experiences across the entire state and bring that to bear, I think would make the plan a little bit more human, a little bit more people focused, and allow people to see themselves better because their voices are being reflected in the things that we actually write.
Thanks, Leslie Ann. Thanks for that reflection. Michelle?
I'll just speak specifically to the transportation summary. I think the thing that was most concerning to me was when I looked at the participant list, after having read through the themes, that most of the people that participated in that were either state level staff or advocates or staff of advocacy organizations. And I think that the suggestions were considering the population of Vermont in terms of the amount of taxpayer dollars we have to support infrastructure and the sprawling nature of our development patterns, and Gina spoke to this a bit in the chat, that the discussion is not realistic in terms of understanding what the bulk of Vermonters are facing relative to transportation, and solutioning emissions reductions in a way that people can engage with. And I think it's not until we propose a tax or a fee, kind of like has recently happened with the clean heat standard, that we are able to get people's attention and get them thinking about how we may need to move forward. And I think with the price of gas going down, that's just another signal to the general public that we're not in a crisis. So I guess I am concerned that we not build assumptions and directions without fully considering opinions beyond those that have been offered so far in this round. That's all I would offer.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah. Other reflections, and I see Gina put some things in the chat. JL?
Yeah, so the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee meetings, the recommendations or the input, it was very broad. There was all sorts of ideas, but I think land access was one of the things that came up a lot, and the cost of land for new and beginning farmers, and the economic viability for farming. And there was a lot of suggestions around state support of farmers, or like, helping farmers get health care, childcare, things like that, to just alleviate some of the economic strain on farmers. And then for private landowners, there was discussion about extending current use to include, maybe smaller pieces of land, where people just want to preserve their forests, and how people can choose not to cut their forests and be, compensated in some way with tax breaks. Again, kind of similar theme, like, how are we going to pay for all of this? How can we support our agricultural communities and foresters, and also preserve our natural lands? And so, yeah, it's tricky. There's kind of conflicting ideas. But I think the biggest thing is just resiliency for people who are earning a living, working lands, folks. So that's it.
Thanks, JL. Yeah. Other reflections, even if they're just initial from having participated in some of the events or reading some of these summaries? Anything else people want to shout out right now? Great. So you've seen in the chat a couple things. One, both Sophie and Jane mentioned that there's more activity that's happened that's not part of this briefing packet right now. Both things that happened yesterday and the day before around engaging with local communities, municipal level action. So that happened most recently, and we'll make sure that those summaries and things get pushed to you. Also, there's been a number of things happening around the Cap and Invest study that also been engaging a variety of Vermonters. And that'll be something that you as a council discuss together when the technical work on the Cap and Invest study is ready to be shared. So that's all additional work that's happening out there. And I'll note the other pieces of, Chris Campany just put a big one in the chat. So great. Okay, Chris, do you want to jump in?
I think Jael had her hand up first.
That might be an old hand, I think.
Oh, okay. So has the council heard numbers about how many people have been displaced from the last couple of years flooding and how many we anticipate will be displaced?
I don't know. I wonder if folks maybe in the rural resilience subcommittee, if those are some data points that you've had. Any folks from rural resilience, Andrea or others, like, do you have any of that data that Chris is talking about?
No, I don't think so. It's definitely available, and we've heard different reports. Not in the subcommittee, though.
And has the council heard from long-term recovery groups yet about the experience of the frontline communities and households that are experiencing the damage now?
I mean, we have not scheduled or had a specific conversation with that type of stakeholder group.
I would encourage the steering committee to look at that and encourage us to have that engage with them as a full council, not just a subcommittee, because we're living this right now. And that might better help us engage on especially the adaptation and resilience sides of this.
Right.
I would encourage us to make that time.
Right. And just to be very clear, I'm understanding the specific thing. You're suggesting that there is engagement with people who have lost their homes through flooding in those kinds of communities. That's what you're.
Yeah, and to make sure everybody understands, as a council, talking to officials in Barry, Montpelier, other communities, we have issues down here about, to the extent we know how many people have been displaced already, how much housing has been lost, how much housing, and I've unfortunately been thinking about this stuff a lot for, a couple of decades. And, there's also the anticipation of not only how many people already have been displaced, but will over the coming years, as some people just can't continue to live in damaged households, or as buyouts happen, or as properties come into compliance with National Flood Insurance Program standards and rents have to go up. It just seems like the council should have a good grasp on what the events that we've already had imply for displacement of frontline communities from an equity and justice standpoint. Because it's not hypothetical, it's very real. And what we need to be thinking about as a council, especially on the adaptation and resilience. Now, that's just flooding. We've got other issues now, right, in our regions in severe drought. We see what can happen based on the wildland fires nearby in New York, PA, and New Jersey. So I just want to make sure that adaptation and resilience has the place at the table that it needs to, and that as a council, we're taking this up. Now, of course, like I say, I've been gone, so maybe you guys are fully engaged in this, and and what I'm suggesting is not necessary because you've already covered it. But if we haven't, I just feel like it's a responsibility for us to do so.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate that. And I think in the chat also, Jane's throwing in the fact that parallel to the council process is the resilience implementation strategy. And I think maybe there's an opportunity on these issues to share information and share data if there is data being done, or, if people are being reached. So there's an opportunity there to, if that's already happening over there, to pull that into the council conversation too. Okay. All right, folks. Well, thanks, and encourage folks. I know it's a big chunk of, big briefing book, but encourage you to spend a little time in it. We will be referring back to it as we go forward in the work in the next months, and adding to it as new conversations happen. Okay. All right. So if folks are okay, let's switch gears and talk about the subcommittees. We've invited subcommittee co-chairs to join us today. In the prompt we gave them, in part, this is the steering committee thought this would be a good use of council time. As subcommittees the 3 subcommittees generating recommendations are all in the thick of it in trying to pull together their recommendations and through their task groups. They're just starting as subcommittees to pull all that information together and figure out what it means and the prioritization piece. And so we invited subcommittee co-chairs to talk a little bit about, giving a heads up to some of the issues that may be the most challenging issues. If there's anything subcommittee co-chairs want to ask the council, this is a good time now. We will meet on December 16th, and all 3 subcommittees are expected to lift up recommendations and a handful of highest priority actions. In that time, there's been some cross-cutting conversations around education, workforce, and land use, and we'll have some window on December 16th into that as well. All right, but with that, let us go ahead and jump in. And without any particular order, I'd be interested, we have Jael and Billy here from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And if you all, what we have right now is the next 45 minutes or so for the 3 subcommittees to have a conversation. And I'd also welcome Liz Amler. We can talk a little bit about the cross-cutting stuff too, if we want to. But so imagine we have 5-10 minutes per subcommittee. Let's just talk a little bit about what's going on and what are some of the big ticket things that are happening and things you want to flag up to the council even now. So Jael, Billy, you want to kick us off here?
Sure. Defer to Jael as the council member to go first. I'm happy to fill in my thoughts after that.
Great. Thanks, Billy. Jael, do you want to jump in?
Sure.
Volunteered?
Yeah, it's been kind of a beast. Our task groups are finally getting going, and I feel like some good kind of prioritization has happened, and we're starting to see some of those key recommendations come up to the top. There's still a lot to go through, and we have a meeting tomorrow, and I hope that we will really get to decision-making point in terms of what actions and strategies we want to prioritize. I think the public input sessions are helpful in helping kind of guide our decision making. So I found them very useful in terms of like how I think about what we need to prioritize and kind of what we can put on the back burner for now. I'll let Billy weigh in as well.
Thanks, Jael. Yeah, I agree with all that. I do think, to be totally candid, that this whole process has struggled due to a lack of priority setting by the council at the front end of the process. The initial climate action plan has over 200 actions, expecting a small group of volunteer subcommittees to establish priorities in like a couple month period while digesting all this input is the range of actions are so broad as it relates to climate across the three subcommittees. It's almost an impossible task without creating some sideboards or priorities. And I think you saw that in the initial all the public input sessions where there was lots of good ideas, but they were all over the place, a range of feasibility, they were conflicting. And I really think that it's the council's job to identify what the priorities are for the council and then let the subcommittees do the work to flesh out those details. So I think, in the future, I'd strongly encourage you to pursue a framework like that, because it's been very difficult for a subcommittee to take a real breadth of topics and existing actions and whittle them down and prioritize them. So that's one piece I'd share. And I think it's frankly unfair to the public also when they're asked to participate in these conversations, not to have some sense of what the priorities of the councils are or what's in the range of possible. The other thing I'd say is that the issue of wood fuel and biomass as a source of fuel for both thermal and electrical applications has come up again in our subcommittee with some very strong divergent views. And we need direction from you all as soon as possible on how you want us to deal with that. The council tasked our subcommittee with that work in the past. There was another task group that followed on to that. And then the council approved an addendum to the climate action plan with some very specific actions. And we need to know if you are open to hearing recommendations on this topic again, or whether the actions in the addendum and the plan are still relevant and valid, because we're going to spend a tremendous amount of time on that topic, barring guidance from you all that's going to distract us from doing other important work.
Thanks, Billy.
Can I just add to that a little bit? I thought about these things and then of course forgot them, but during the public input sessions, like not having the whole slate of, pathways, strategies, and recommendations, that spreadsheet available to the public, several people asked for that available, and it is on our website, but it's hard to find. And so I think sending that out to the public would have been helpful. Like these are this is what the subcommittee is looking at. And then subcommittee members have all struggled with what it means by progressing, no action taken. And I mean, Billy has a better grasp of it, but I actually don't have a grasp of what all of those mean in terms of like concrete action steps. And like, is it going to the legislator? Is it being taken? I mean, I know there's descriptions, but it's been challenging to communicate that.
Okay. Yeah. And, I'll note the ag and ecosystem has the largest number of strategies and pathway strategies and actions of any of the subcommittees. It's like 160 or something that were sent your way. Again, because as Billy mentioned, there was not a ton of prioritization that happened last time around. Okay. I'm curious, counselors, as you're hearing Billy and Jael talk, Billy put out a specific request as well. I'm interested if you all first have some questions for Jael and Billy. Second, if you have some input that might help them as they finish up their work in the next month. Any questions for Billy and Jael about how things are going in ag and ecosystem?
David, I don't have any questions, but I do want to thank them both for the immense work they're putting into this. And that really goes for all the subcommittee folks. We're flying this plane and building it, to use a very trite metaphor. And I think these folks are the ones who are really feeling the rub. So thank you for pointing the way on how to do this and for the considerable energy you're putting into it.
Thanks, June. Yeah. Other reflections or comments or questions? Rich?
Well, I just want to follow up on Billy's request concerning biofuels, biomass. Is this something where you're requesting that the council take this up right away and either confirm what we said in the last, in the addendum, or change what we said in the addendum so that we could give some scope, back to the subcommittee?
I don't think it needs to happen immediately, and I defer to JL on this, but I think, right, there's the clean heat standard that contemplates advanced wood heat and other wood fuels as a clean heat measure potentially. And then there's the addendum to the climate action plan that kind of set a path involving additional study and action for the existing wood lead, electric lead biomass plants and kind of future plants. And that full sequence of events has not been implemented. In my view, it's still a relevant and applicable pathway. But we have members of our subcommittee who are advocating for kind of more immediate shutdowns and denial of any new proposals, which I don't think is consistent with what you've adopted. So if you're open to reconsidering how you treat this topic, then that's fine, and we can kind of continue that debate. But if you feel like the work that you did in the last plan is still relevant and that it needs more time to be worked through, then that's really important and helpful feedback for us.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. And it's tricky for you all as a council to do that on the fly right now, I recognize. So I think rather than assume you're going to make some decision right now, I think there's some flavor in the conversation may be helpful, right? So I think if folks have some views about that, you did adopt in April, I think this year, that addendum on biomass. And so you spent some time thinking about it and then you decided on it. If you're looking for the subcommittee to do something beyond that or provide input beyond that, now's a good time to say that. If you're not looking for it, now's a good time to say that too. I just think I'm nervous asking you all as a council to make a decision on something on the fly like that, but I'm happy to have some just informal discussion. So I don't know if any of the counselors have a feeling, any kind of advice to Billy.
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot either. This is a real issue. So at some point, however you see fit to kind of share some thoughts to us, either formally or informally, would appreciate it.
Great.
If I could, David.
Yeah, David, jump in.
Yeah, I understand your question, Billy. But back when we generated that version of the addendum to the plan, it was also made clear that the basic thrust of the plan was that additional studies were needed prior to making any type of public policy decision. And it was made clear, at least it was my understanding, and please don't rely on my memory. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But it was presented to us that, in fact, there were not the resources to be able to complete those studies in a timely manner because there was no money set aside, and what monies were set aside for other things. Consequently, the plan or the report out from the task group was placed on a shelf, and it sits there because at the heart of the thrust of that report was a series of studies that needed to be done before a decision could be made.
Thanks, David. Again, just some quick input on this. Otherwise, we're going to need to pivot over to another subcommittee in just a moment. But if anyone has any other input for Billy and Jael, welcome it. Jael, do you want to jump in?
Well, just on that topic of the biomass plant, I mean, I was fairly new to the council, and yeah, I don't know if we can't fund the research, can we revisit the recommendations and come up with a different plan, because it's brought up pretty much every time it's brought up by the public, it's brought up by subcommittee members. So I feel like we need to come up with some sort of statement or revisit the decision we made in April.
Yeah, my inclination is that a priority action out of our subcommittee would be to find funding to do that study. And that's the first step for all of this, but certainly defer to you all.
Thanks, Billy. Julie?
Yeah, I was going to say essentially the same thing, which is the Climate Council, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't asked for funding for that work yet. That's a request that would need to go to the legislature or to the governor. And absent the council prioritizing that as a request, I think sitting around and sort of waiting for somebody to decide to fund it is not going to change the status quo. And so I think the part of the conversation that's probably needed is where this ranks among all the other things that the council might want to invest in, from pathway. I mean, there's some that are statutorily obligated, like the measuring and assessing progress tool that we're in the throes of working on. There are others that are certainly important, but may not be mandated, and trying to I think having that conversation is important, but I don't think just expecting, because we've indicated that it's necessary to do that kind of evaluation that David Dean outlined, without taking some steps to try to seek out the funding is probably sufficient, and also wouldn't be comfortable backing away from those recommendations without having made such an effort.
Nice. Okay. So let's leave that conversation there for now. And I really appreciate that. And it sounds like, you got a little bit of input there, Billy and Jael. Thanks for sharing how things are going. I wonder if we want to pivot over to rural resilience. And Andrea, if you want to give us a update on how things are going and some of the key things happening in the subcommittee.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'd say the way I'm going to frame the challenges is more, it's not so much on content, although I do appreciate what Billy raised about some guidance on prioritization, and maybe I'll circle back to that at the end of my comments. But the challenges that we've been experiencing are more related to process, I'd say. We've had a struggle with the composition of our group, even at the leadership, the co-chairs. I've been co-chairing by myself for most of this.
And my apologies.
No, there's no need for apology.
But it was illness that just threw me.
Yep. No need at all, David, and certainly not bringing that up to point any fingers or anything. It's just been a challenge. It's taken some time to appoint new members of the council that would have an interest in being on rural resilience. And so there's just been a gap there, and it's put burden on other subcommittee members, especially state staff, because they are who I've been comfortable with leaning on for input and sort of organizing. So I'll just say that has definitely been a challenge, and related to that is just the capacity of the members of the subcommittee to be present. And that, I've heard that from the other subcommittees as well. Working in our task groups, there have been a lot of meetings, working on weekly meetings, and it's a lot for task group members and subcommittee members to get all of this together. And it's just been it's a very aggressive schedule. So that has been a real challenge to get regular participation. We often have task groups that are supposed to be 6 or 7 members who only have 2 members. So I've definitely heard from some of the members that they are thinking of leaving and appointing somebody else to represent their interests. So just that change in composition really has been a struggle. Understanding the recommendations, like Jael said, sort of understanding the status and what it means, even understanding what the last actions meant, and trying to dissect the wording and the language to see if we should keep it, modify it. I personally think there's far too much in this climate action plan, and it sort of does a disservice. I know we're leaning towards prioritization for the next climate action plan, but how do you go from 230? Do you cut it down to 150? And is that better? I'm not sure. So I think the council needs to do some thinking on how to make this plan tangible. I would like to hear from the council what the expectation is for the December 13th, or it's a December 13th deadline, but the December 16th meeting, for what they want to see. Because certainly we're not going to be able to present, 40 recommendations or modifications that we're thinking about. We're doing our best in the rural resilience to cut down recommendations and sort of lump, but that might put more burden on the narrative and make the plan longer. So we're kind of struggling with how to be pointed in our recommendations. So I would like to hear from the council what that expectation is for the presentation on the 16th, so that we can be most productive during that time. Yeah, so I do have concerns with our subcommittee being able to get recommendations together, having those really vetted out well through the just transitions rubric, and then prioritizing them in the framework that's described. That's a lot of work in 3 weeks time, and we are still just vetting our own recommendations for our task groups and trying to pare them down. So it feels like a lot in the next 3 weeks. So that's a concern. And then there's cross subcommittee sort of coordination and reconciliation. So that maybe is something that can come later, and that the council is going to have to figure out if we bring recommendations that seem to have overlap and should be themed or lumped together, something for the council to think about, a way to organize that and bring it forward in the plan. I'm sure that rural resilience and ag and ecosystems has a lot to think about in nature-based solutions. And we just haven't had the time to do that coordination on a broader scale. And like I said, maybe that can come later, but just something that is on my mind. And that's what I had to share.
Thanks, Andrea. Really appreciate that. One thing I'll note is that the Climate Action Office is preparing and will send out probably later today some additional guidance around the prioritization process, Andrew, that you mentioned, because we've given signals of it in the previous guidance, right? But it's been sort of, and then we'll give you some more guidance. So more guidance is coming, and trying to not only, if you're trying to make sure only high priority actions are in the plan, so that's sort of the big chunk of however many you have, like 80 from rural resilience, or I'm not sure what the number is, right?
Close.
Yeah. So some big chunk that you have, and try to make sure that you put some prioritization on that based on the Global Warming Solutions Act criteria and just transitions. But also what we've been talking about is the handful of actions that might get lifted up into a top 20, top 30, right, of that the council actually ends up deciding on. But it's really helpful to have subcommittees lift up that handful. So we're getting more specific what a handful means and all that. So expect that probably later today.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So thoughts, questions, help to provide, Andrea? Any reactions, counselors, as you hear this? Chris?
Yeah, just comment. I mean, Andrea, Bronwyn, Carolina, and Scott, and everybody who's been active on that subcommittee have just done enormous amounts of work, and really appreciative of everything that's happening. One of the challenges that I find coming in kind of late to it is a lot of the recommendations, a lot of the policy things that I'm seeing, I don't know, are at such a high level and almost kind of abstract relative to the work that we're doing on the ground, trying to help towns with adaptation and resilience. Trying to figure out how to remedy that, like who else to bring into the conversation who's actively involved in this stuff, especially at the rural level. I know in Vermont that our continuum of ruralness is very finely grained. We're fundamentally rural state, but some of the engagement is really among communities that are better resourced than a lot of other ones to engage in this. And just making sure that we're kind of covering that spectrum. So that's not a complaint. It's just it's an observation, and planning is always an iterative process. So it may not be able to, we may not be able to squeeze it into the limited timeline that we've got. But there are a lot of lessons being learned out there right now as we're kind of in the, different stages of really having to kind of do deeper dives with communities that are, again, I'm not using hyperbole here, that are kind of facing existential threats to their built environment. So just wanted to note that. But many thanks to all the state personnel and the volunteers and all who are engaging in this, because I don't think you can get much more out of them, and the work has been very high quality. It's just bandwidth, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that level of granularity of the actions is a struggle, because if you start lumping, then you lose it, and you might miss out on some details that are important. But if you just have so many actions, then it's sort of, you just get lost in a sea of actions and can't get out of it. It's quicksand.
Yeah, and I just add, like, given the weather events we've had over the past 2 years, it would have been helpful if the council said, hey, we want your top priority in resilience to be response and recovery from significant flood events at the community scale. That would have given us something to work with. But instead, we had 250 actions at various levels of granularity to work through.
Thanks, Billy. Kelly?
Thanks, Billy and Andrew, for those comments, because it's really helpful to hear that.
Your mic is a little low, Kelly, so you might want to speak up.
Can you hear me a little bit if I lean in?
Yeah.
Anyway, since I'm not on these subcommittees that are doing the real prioritization, it really helps to hear from you and what you're experiencing. And I keep thinking about what we heard. I don't know if everyone heard it, but from the state's hazard mitigation group, where they had something like 100 different actions that they were considering, and then they narrowed it down to 25, and then they narrowed it down again, and they ended up with 10. And it's not like those other 90 actions are lost. They're still there as things to take up in the future, but I feel like they did it was a tough job, but they did it. And so that is sort of where I think we've been talking about in council meetings and the steering committee about how to help with prioritizing to find those like really critical ones that we want that are going to make a big impact, or are the most feasible, or etc. And then to Billy's comment about wanting more guidance from the council, I have the concern that I completely understand and respect that request. But I also have a concern that if the council were to say, here are your priorities, do these things, we would end up accidentally just reinforcing the status quo, because we are not individually all experts in all of these areas, and we may not come up with some of the creative solutions that we're going to need. But hearing from the public, even if those suggestions are all over the map, and then hearing from the subcommittees and the task groups, like, you all have access to some different ideas and different approaches that I don't know that the council would consider. But I also agree it would be really helpful if we could make this more of a back and forth, and have more of like, here are some ideas. Do these seem feasible? Which ones should we prioritize? And have the council be weighing in more frequently in the process. And I'm saying this is we're like already deep in the process, but that was just my thought about that concern that Billy raised about needing more guidance.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah. Anything else on this subcommittee? All right. So why don't we, oh yeah, Jared, I was going to go to cross sector, but Jared, go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, David. And this isn't specific to this subcommittee, but it's just wanting to pause on the kind of tension that Billy is highlighting and other folks have brought up, and just want to reflect from a process perspective that I think part of the challenge is, I'll just say from my perspective on the steering committee, when we kind of reviewed the proposed kind of timeline and process for developing recommendations, it was very much a subcommittee up to the council process, rather than a council directive to the subcommittee process. And so and I think that there's, you can see it both ways, but there's a challenge there, right? Because I think, I'll just speak for myself as a counselor in terms of what we end up recommending on agriculture and ecosystems or on rural resilience and adaptation. I very much want to have the benefit of knowing what the folks on those subcommittees that are digging deep, that are focused on those issues, that have that experience and expertise, are lifting up as opportunities, as priorities, as challenges. And so and that's kind of the process we've outlined, right? It's subcommittees are drafting their recommendations and priorities to lift up for council attention and deliberation, rather than the council saying, this is the output in terms of the specific content that we want, and then develop that. And I can see it both ways. I just want to note that there is a balance and a tension there. And right now, our process to date has been very much subcommittees up to the council, rather than council directives to subcommittees on their substantive content recommendations.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah. David Dean.
One of the things that was talked about at the Rural Resilience Committee level was engaging NGOs in some of the task groups or some of the activities, or to at least do outreach to get them engaged. And I just wanted to reiterate it here for the discussion that I still think that is a very good idea, because they are a resource that does not necessarily rely on state resources, whether it's time or cash. And I wanted to use as an example, and some of you have probably seen it in the papers, a recent $11.5 million federal grant to the Connecticut River Conservancy to create live, healthy riparian zones. And if you're going to talk resilience in the era of flooding, then you got to talk riparian zones and protected riparian zones. And so that I use them as an example of an NGO bringing resources to the table that can assist in meeting some of the priorities that are listed by the subcommittees. Because I know riparian protection is on the list of things for rural resilience. So I just use that as an example, and I just want to make sure that we continue to reach out to our NGO partners to engage with us.
Thanks, David. Okay, so let's talk cross-sector. Rich, do you want to kick us off there and how things are going, the different task groups and your process?
Well, I'm going to ask Melissa. She wants to go first.
Great.
Sure, I can go first. Rich and I spoke a little bit earlier in the week when we saw this agenda item. Just building off, I think I'll list maybe 3 challenges our subcommittee's facing, building off of what Andrea said about capacity. Just really frankly, attendance and engagement is just like not at the level that we'd like to see in subcommittee meetings. In this crunch phase leading up to December, as of October, cross-sector switched to weekly meetings, but we're really only getting like maybe half of our subcommittee at each meeting, which just presents a challenge. Last meeting, we had really good attendance from utilities that were invited to provide public comment, but there is a pretty small number of subcommittee members there. And this just means that we're not able to engage with the stakeholders or hear that input directly. It's certainly not meant as a criticism of the subcommittee members. We all have like full-time jobs that don't involve council responsibilities, but it is a limitation, and just really want to be transparent to the full council about the level of engagement that's happening and the level of discussion that's going into the recommendations that that you all will be receiving from us in December. The ask maybe going forward, the council could potentially re-examine what the time investment required in subcommittee membership is. I think the steering document, the guidance we have says 4 hours a week. during this time period. I'd say it's probably significantly more if we're expected to really digest material in advance of the meetings and spend 2 hours in the meetings. Second challenge, I think that maybe is potentially unique to cross-sector, but several of our subcommittee members have mentioned we don't have modeling results around the GHG impact of various policies and measures that are under consideration by our subcommittee. So I think that's just hindering our ability to prioritize. For instance, we're exploring things like, what if we put in place an appliance standard for heating equipment? What if we strengthen building energy codes? Without having the GHG impact of those, it's really hard to prioritize our recommendations, and that's just kind of hindering our ability to put forth the strongest recommendations. We take the charge under the Global Warming Solutions Act seriously. Cross-sector is supposed to be looking at the largest possible GHG reductions in the most cost-effective manner. And without that data point, we're struggling. I just worry that we might miss the mark with our recommendations, and they might end up being costly to Vermonters, but not get us where we need to be with emissions reductions. And that certainly wouldn't be responsive to all of the public input and feedback that we're getting around affordability from Vermonters. Related note, I think more guidance on how the council wants us to look at cost effectiveness could be helpful, and that could be a whole separate discussion topic. But really, how do we balance societal cost effectiveness with affordability at the household level? And then the final one that I think folks have highlighted, I will just note, ditto for cross-sector. We're struggling with identifying funding sources. We again have an extensive list of recommendations, and they, not to be glib, they essentially read like a wish list. It's a lot of programs and policies that Vermonters would like to see implemented without a clear path forward on paying for those. So I'll leave it there for Rich to flesh out anything I didn't cover.
Thanks, Melissa. Excellent. I guess I really am only going to make 2 points in addition to Melissa's points. First is, although today we've been asked to talk about the challenges we all face in drawing up the cap, and you've heard a lot about those challenges across the board. But just for a moment, I'd like to focus on the opportunities as well. We have the opportunity to reduce Vermonters' ongoing fossil fuel heating bills, which we know in many years are well over $1 billion per year. And we can reduce energy costs for those with the highest energy burdens, and we can lower the thermal sector's contribution to climate disruption. So we have opportunities here, not just challenges. And I would, just to inform the council as to at least where the thermal test group is going. In general, the test group and the committee as a whole are working on 2 levels because we need a combination of 2 different things. We need high-level policy drivers that can adjust over time, particularly for transportation and for thermal, to keep us on track to 2050. And we need a set of complementary policies that deliver progress in key areas, whether that's electric vehicles, low-income weatherization, the number of heat pump installations, protecting renters as the transition goes on, and so forth. I think the committee is doing okay on developing the complementary policies. There are a number of good recommendations, and I think even in the absence, I'm agreeing completely with Melissa's point that we struggle in the absence of an analytical model that allows us to weigh policy A versus policy B. We have enough knowledge from past practice to have, reasonable estimations for prioritizing. And I think that the test groups are going to be able to do a decent job of that. But as for the overarching policies, I think, we're kind of at an impasse, and we need to possibly present decision makers with a choice across a few options. For example, we could recommend a modified clean heat standard, perhaps simplified, perhaps with a cost cap, something different than what's under review right now. We are engaged as a state in studying whether Vermont should join a cap and invest regime, for example, with New York or with the Western Climate Initiative. That's a high-level policy option. We could recommend and are considering, in addition to those two, an all fuels efficiency program that would include criteria for both greenhouse gas reductions and energy savings. And that could be, a Vermont-based program. Doesn't require us to engage with other states to do that. And so all of those options present, analytical challenges. We don't really have the modeling yet to come down on one side or the other on those options, and also political uncertainties. There's a inherent tension in the current world where the Climate Council is required to come up with a plan, and we don't really know in advance, can't know in advance, whether either the administration or the legislature is going to sign on to the plan to take the actions that we recommend. And I accept that we can't know that. But it does, if you just think about the big picture here, we're across all the committees, so that's what we face. We have an obligation to come up with the best possible plan, and then we just don't know whether it would be more realistic to recommend policy A versus policy B because of what the political branches are going to do with the plan. So yeah. I'm naming a basic reality that's baked into the structure of the Climate Council, and we had this last time, we have it this time.
Thanks, Rich. I want to point out too in the chat how Jane's, there's been mention, well, Rich, you and Melissa both mentioned it's frustrating not to have the scenarios, technical work done. It's in progress. It'll be done in February. Unfortunately, it's not super helpful for the subcommittees right now, but it will be very helpful for the council. And so one of the things I imagine that your subcommittee is going to do is put some caveats, right? Be like, this is what we're thinking now, but we really look forward to seeing the scenario, et cetera, right?
That's realistic. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was really helpful, Melissa and Rich. Any questions or other people who are involved in that subcommittee want to chime in? Anything from the council makes you think of when you hear what's going on there?
Thanks, David. But one thing I want to just add, the task groups, Melissa is right that the workload on the committee has been really tough. But the task groups have been, and particularly the thermal task group, has been really diligent and working extremely hard, and has come up with a range of good, solid policy options that are now going to get presented to the full committee. And they deserve thanks like some of the other task groups we've heard about today.
Thanks, Rich. Absolutely. All right. Any reactions or questions for this subcommittee? Any of the tensions that Rich and Melissa mentioned? Okay. Great. All right, so that was running across the whole gamut of the subcommittees. I will note, and maybe Liz Amler can help us the most here, there are cross-cutting issues being, conversations happening right now on education, workforce, and land use stuff. And Liz can do a better job of giving the proper description of those. But Liz, can you just give us a heads up sort of how those conversations are going and the expectation for December 16th of what those groups will be able to do?
Yeah, so there's compact settlement, education, and workforce development. They're all are going to have their next and aiming to be the final meeting for these working groups the first week in December. And in the interim have been doing just really digging into the work, more like task groups prior leading up to this final meeting to kind of review it and get these cross-cutting recommendations in the best place that they can be prior to that December 16th meeting.
Great. So council, expect to have draft content from those cross-cutting groups as well. And if you are tempted to be involved in them, you haven't, contact Liz, because she's organizing those calls on those topics. And obviously those topics touch into the subcommittees as well, right? Rural, ag and ecosystem, rural resilience are all kind of working on some compact settlement stuff. Even transportation is working on compact settlement stuff, right? So that's okay. Like, it's not terrible if subcommittees and these cross-cutting groups, both put some ideas on the table that look kind of similar. That's going to be the role of the council going forward, is like consolidate that in and make sense of it. And Liz, you've had people from the subcommittees in those conversations too, right? So they're bringing that voice of, hey, it's come up this way in the subcommittee, or it's this way in the initial climate action plan, right? You've had that participation.
Yeah, we've had representatives from each drafting subcommittee are part of these cross-cutting groups. But yeah, there's definitely some overlap, but I think it's okay. And because sometimes the expertise really does reside in a certain subcommittee, but I think it's okay for it to be worked on, and then maybe it'll ultimately live in a cross-cutting group or somewhere else. But yeah.
Super.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So that's going on as well. Any questions, comments about the cross-cutting stuff? All right. So the bottom line is there's an enormous amount of work happening right now, and an enormous amount of volunteer hours being put into this, and blood, sweat, and tears in this. So a huge shout out to all those people, including some of you on the council, who are really leaning aggressively into that, and thank you. And we're going to do our very best on December 16th to get inputs from all of this with some of the highest priority. And as Jay mentioned in the chat, the Climate Action Office will be helping to put together some templates and PowerPoint templates and that kind of thing for the subcommittees to make it easier for you to present your stuff and clear what it is we're encouraging you to present on the 16th of December. Okay. Why don't we take a pause for public comment? If anybody's been joining our meeting today and feels like they want to offer something up now, encourage anybody who's not a counselor who'd want to jump in and provide some input. Now's a great time to do it. Feel free to use your Zoom raise hand function, or small enough group, just open up your mic as well. We'll make it happen. So any public comment? Zach Porter, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, and thank you for holding this meeting today and offering this public comment. I'm Zach Porter. I'm the Executive Director of Standing Trees based in Montpelier. And I just had a couple of comments real quick. First off, just thank you for, year after year now, I know you've put in a tremendous amount of time on the climate action plan. I know it's tremendously time consuming, and I applaud the council and the subcommittees for all of your efforts. And I wanted to make a comment related to the discussion that was going on earlier about the recommendations coming out of the subcommittees right now. I'm not sure if I was hearing this accurately or not, so I just want to, I guess, repeat back to all of you what I heard, which was a little bit concerning to me. I got the impression from the discussion earlier that there might be some degree of pressure on or filtering of what's coming out of, for example, the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee to match what the Climate Council has said in the past, or the direction that the Climate Council wants to go. And that just seems contrary to me to the way, in theory, I would hope this process would work, where the subcommittee makes a recommendation that it feels is appropriate, and elevates that to the Climate Council for its review. And of course, the Climate Council gets to make a decision on what to move forward. But I certainly hope that there will not be a kind of direction pointed at the subcommittees to, you know, to leave something out or to move in a different direction. Because I think that that's the purpose of the subcommittees, is to think creatively right now and pull forward what they're hearing from the public, what they're figuring out on their own, and looking at the many recommendations from the last version of the plan and what might be elevated this time around. I hope that there won't be some kind of a censorship or filtering going on from the top down, because I think that's really the role of the council, is to evaluate what comes out of the committee, not to tell the subcommittee what to recommend. So that was concerning to me as I heard that, and I may be mishearing it, but I just wanted to flag that for the council to consider. Anyways, thanks for the chance to weigh in.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate it. Matthew, the floor. Go ahead, please.
Yes, and thank you for, hosting us all. The biggest question that haven't yet heard from you is how are we gonna, pay? Like I said, there's one person that said how we're gonna pay for all of this, knowing that the next biennium is gonna be tough for us all, as we know. What happened in the legislative and election seasons and so forth. We haven't yet done any audits or current audits or budget, items yet. So I'm wondering if you can incorporate that into the plan. Maybe it might get people to see what the trajectory is, how much budget we have, how much money we have on hand, or other ways to make this work. Because without a good budget plan or without a strategy of finance, you already know it's going to be downed as soon as possible. Nobody's going to go forward with it because they don't see your actual finance plan of how we're going to fund all of this, moving forward. These initiatives that are great, for the environment, great for towns and municipal buildings, great for Vermont. But it's going to come down to how much money do you have? How much can we budget for? How much can we finance? And where can we get that finance to complete some of these projects? Because, like I said, that's the biggest question on everybody's mind, is how are we going to pay for this moving forward? Thank you. Knowing it's a good plan.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for the feedback on that. Annette, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I have a few comments on the documents that were produced. First, I attended the transportation public input session, and then I watched all the rest of them except the two yesterday on double speed on YouTube, and think that the report does a good job of capturing what was said. I want to compliment you on that. I would like to see the attendees. I was glad those were in there, but I would like to see those broken out into counselors, subcommittee members, and people associated with organizations and the public. This is following up on Michelle's comment. My observation was that the majority of attendees were with organizations or state government or were climate counselors. You won't know that until you break it out, but are you reaching the public? And so then the flip side of that is the other report on the let's take it to the people, where I was really looking forward, especially to the input at the Rutland Fair, because there's not a whole lot going on in our rural areas, and in particular in southwestern Vermont. And instead, I couldn't, somebody mentioned Brock in one of the comments, but I would like to see, again, the bullet points that you got from everybody so that we have a better idea of the whole world of what people are saying. And then this goes to Chris's comment about rural Vermont. Now, this is not a political comment because I do not engage in politics, but after the election, I was looking at the Secretary of State's website, and I was looking at the map for Lieutenant Governor, red and blue. And it would be similar for the Senate races. And I had already mapped where every climate counselor is. I did it when they were first appointed, and then I did it again when changes have been made. And there is a real overlap between who's on the climate council and the blue areas. Except for the state government employees, every member of the climate council lives in Chittenden County, Washington County, or along I-89. There are more counties not represented on the climate council than are represented. And except I think Kelly lives in Franklin County. Everyone else is in what I think Chris has called the Burlington Montpelier bubble. Chris and David are down next to I-89. So this sort of came to light in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee where the utilities were invited. And the rural utilities said things that, frankly, some of the climate counselors on that subcommittee should have known. And it was bringing a rural perspective that is missing. And I know you aren't responsible for the appointments, but we have 3 open seats now. And whoever is talking to leadership really needs to make sure that there is more geographic diversity in the makeup of this council. Bennington County's not represented, Rutland County, Addison County. I mean, you want the list? It's a long list. And this is a problem. And so that meeting that cross-sector mitigation held when the utilities were invited in was one of the best meetings I've seen of this whole climate council, because you actually got some good input from people who had real world experience. And to Chris's point, yes, we need to be talking about what's happening in the real world. And I have to go now because there's a forester here, because somebody is doing a clear cut on the property adjoining mine with a cutter feller buncher, and I'm having it looked at. So thank you for my comments. I guess the only thing I will end with is to say, I really want you to think about whether or not this climate council needs to exist. You have an Office of Climate, you have all these programs that all the testimony I've heard is that there are workforce issues, there's money issues, but that the work is all in line to be done. Does this climate council need to exist? Thank you very much. And I do appreciate all the time you all are spending in meetings.
Thanks, Annette. Okay. Other comments from folks who have been listening into our meeting today? Okay. All right. So here we go. We'll wrap up here. For counselors, if you want to be more engaged in the work of the subcommittees or these cross-cutting groups, this is a great time to do that. There's some important work that needs to happen there, and thanks for everyone who's been doing that. We'll see all of us together on December 16th. And then we've got meetings coming up in January. Our rhythm of activity is going to pick up once all this material is provided to us. And we'll be working over the winter to consolidate and make sense of it and drive towards a draft report in the end of March. All right. I think that's it, folks. Anything else before we wrap up, counselors? This is the hard, difficult work of sort of collaborative public policy. So thanks everyone for being part of it.
I'll offer a happy Thanksgiving
And a happy Thanksgiving.
and a motion to adjourn.
I love the motion. Thanks, Chris. Take care, everyone. Have a good holiday break. Hopefully we can all celebrate Thanksgiving well. Take care, folks.